Welcome to part two of our conversation with Phil Clark. Phil Clark about Dave Brubeck. Phil is the author of Dave Brubeck, A Life and Times, a very recently published biography of Dave Brubeck, which is getting just marvelous reviews. So welcome again, Phil.
Thank you.
Phil, thank you very, very much for taking
Pleasure.
time out. So at the end of part one, we were talking a little bit about Paul Desmond
Yeah.
and relationship with Dave Brubeck and the fact that they were um, very opposite in personalities. And it begs the next question I was going to ask. Jazz, at least in public consciousness, has a large percentage of eccentric folks and folks with fairly significant problems. You think of Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, people like that. Not obviously not all, and like most stereotypes, probably highly inaccurate with a grain of truth. And here we have one of the really very major figures in jazz. And from what I read, I think he was married for 70 years. He lived in the suburbs. He was probably, the guy you stand in line behind to get a bagel and coffee. I don't know if you get bagels in the UK.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Our great contribution. Um, is there some irony there in that this very, conservative from a lifestyle point of view fellow was a jazz giant, or is it just that there's that stereotype and it's not really true at all?
It's a bit of both. I think, I mean, it is true that, jazz, you think of, I mean, all the people you mentioned, and Charles Mingus and all sorts of people, but, also that is kind of true in all sorts of other music as well. I think Dave, I think he was just, he was so focused on music that simply anything else, well, music and his family and anything else, he just, anything that was likely to disrupt that, he just sort of kept to one side. And he once said that, one reason why he never did drugs was if you try and, he said something like, you trying to play all those intricate rhythms when you're stoned, and you simply can't sort of, just the sheer kind of intellectual energy. If if your mind is kind of away with the fairies, then, you can't, you can't do that. And he was when he came out on stage, he had this incredible charisma and magnetism, and I mean, I saw him play in enormous concert halls, and as soon as he walked out, he just sort of had the audience in his hand, and there was a kind of warmth and a generosity to him that that really managed to communicate. And even into well old age, he would do that. He would play a gig, and he's up into his kind of late 80s, and then he would sort of happily sit backstage afterwards, for hours as signing,
Right.
sort of signing albums and their CDs, and people would people would come and say, I saw you in 1962, and and he would sort of
Right.
so he was, but he was incredibly generous and approachable. And somehow there was just this kind of spirit of generosity in the music that he sort of that he carried around with him. And again, I guess it comes back to what I said in part one. In a way, the music is on one level non-threatening. It's but it kind of it has this incredible sort of intellectual energy that that's kind of draws you in, and somehow somehow he was sort of built from all those kind of from all those different contradictions.
Mm-hmm. I saw him very late in his life, and it was,
Yeah.
I noted what you said. It's and I was glad I got the opportunity to. It was beautiful. It was an outdoor.
When was that?
It was at the Planting Fields Arboretum on Long Island, and
Yeah.
it was probably 15. It was a few years before he died. It was probably in the mid 90s, I want to say.
Oh, okay. So did he have Bill Smith with him on clarinet
I,
or
I,
Bobby Miller?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
it's a beautiful, if you're ever on Long Island, it's Long Island actually is a lot prettier than it's the stereotype of Long Island. So it's actually a beautiful, beautiful place.
I've been there. Yeah. No.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
great. And they don't have concerts there anymore for some reason, which is a real shame. Um, I'm sure that one of the big elements in the book you wrote and in the the life of Dave Brubeck is the is race. I think it's
Yeah.
an issue that can't be gotten around.
Mm.
Could you please tell the story of the Time magazine cover and Duke Ellington, and then
Oh, right. Yeah.
comment a little bit more broadly on just that whole issue. I'm not even going to phrase it in a question. It's you've forgotten more about it than I'll ever know. But
It's just a big issue, really. Well,
but
so, yeah, I mean, the Time magazine story is kind of, it is emblematic of so much of it in a way. It's often there's a misconception that Dave was the first jazz musician on the cover of Time Out, on the cover of Time magazine, and that's not true. The first was Louis Armstrong. But you often see that one of the myths that sort of percolates around is that Dave was the first. But at the time, so this was 1954, I think it was. Yes, 54, and Dave was making his first studio album for Columbia, which was called a Brubeck Time, and the sales team at Columbia kind of knitted together this a PR package, which included a cover on Time, a magazine, and somehow even before Dave was doing sort of consciously, musically with time signatures, the sort of the whole kind of sort of meta concept of time seemed to kind of, seemed to kind of hang around him really. So yeah, so that so there was this big story in Time, a magazine, and at the time they were also working on a cover story about Duke Ellington, and I think there was this sort of slight debate about whether Dave would appear first on the cover or Duke. And because of the Brubeck Time album, it just sort of, it just somehow made sense to run the story about Dave at first. But who would guess it that it just so happened that Dave and Duke were on the road together in a package tour. And Dave was in his hotel room, and there was a sort of knock on the door at about 7:30 in the morning. And he put his dressing gown on, and Duke was standing there with a copy of Time, a magazine, which he handed to Dave and said, "Congratulations, Dave." And Dave kind of didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. To be honest, he was so obviously, he was so elated to be on the cover of Time, a magazine, but to have it handed to him by the man who'd been his absolute hero, sort of, sort of way back, was quite an emotional moment. And when I was researching at the book at the Brubeck archive, everything is very sort of ordered by year and month, and you sort of go through the file. And in the so that I think the story I came out at the start of 55, I think, was at the end of 54. I can't quite remember, but anyway, I found, perhaps what would have been Dave's original copy of Time, a magazine, in the folder, and I wondered if that was, the copy that Ellington had actually handed to him in the hotel.
Did he? What I read, and you would be able to speak to this. Did Brubeck? Is it true that Brubeck said to Ellington, "It should have been you"?
Yeah, I think that. Well, yes, I mean that is certainly how it's been reported, but whether but I think certainly he felt that there was like a natural order of things, and obviously, if you're going to run a cover story about any jazz musician, then almost certainly Louis Armstrong should be first,
Right.
and and Dave had definitely felt that Ellington beyond anybody else really, I should have been.
Mm-hmm.
I should have been next. And of course, this whole kind of, this whole kind of Time magazine thing, sort of definitely plays into issues of, issues of a race. You touched upon, and whether whether Dave was the kind of was promoted as the kind of sort of white acceptable face of jazz to to mass America. And it's it's a tough thing to quantify. Had Dave Brubeck never existed, I don't suppose Albert Ayler, the avant-garde saxophonist, or John Coltrane in his later years, would have got a kind of more coverage than they did. But I think what Dave did was, the Brubeck quartet appealed to people who simply hadn't gone to jazz before, and he brought this mass audience in. He certainly didn't patronize them. If you listen to his, if you listen to his early records, like kind of Jazz at Oberlin and Jazz at College of Pacific, he's like they improvised for hours on tunes like all the things you are, these kind of long solos. And again, sort of later after the Time Out era, they're sort of live at Carnegie Hall again. It's the sense of improvisational drive is quite audacious. He had brought a mass audience, but he never condescended to them. And I think what he did was he helped implant a debate into the kind of mainstream, into the mainstream press about what jazz was, what jazz there could be, what jazz there should be. And he sort of cracked through into that kind of mainstream press in a way which perhaps hadn't happened before, or at least not since the days of Artie Shaw and Benny Goodman, sort of 20 years earlier.
Now, his band was integrated. Was that a breakthrough at the time, or had there been integrated major acts?
Well, certainly, you go back to the Benny Goodman quartet and all the kind of, he brought Lionel Hampton in, who was a vibraphone a player, right, who was black, and that sort of created a real kind of stir at the time. Right. And there were precedents, but Dave hired Eugene Wright because he really admired Eugene's playing, and sort of Eugene kind of opened the quartet up. He brought Eugene had been sort of really schooled in the kind of Count Basie school of swing, and brought a kind of a very kind of light sort of footed feel to the group. And once Gene was in, there was no kind of compromise. The Dave Brubeck quartet was the Dave Brubeck quartet. He wasn't going to, if he turned up in the south of America and there's some redneck promoter, wanted a white bass player, then the gig, simply didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And Eugene was the bass player, and it was as simple as that, Right. But Eugene really, in a sense, opened the group up to a whole other kind of, sort of rhythmic feel, and he brought in this, almost it shouldn't work. This bass player sort of rooted in Kansas City swing in the Brubeck quartet. It feels like a slightly sort of awkward combination of personalities, but my goodness, it worked, because no matter where Dave went rhythmically and harmonically, Eugene was an absolute rock, a kind of just sort of earthing the harmony, and just keeping the whole thing kind of constant, as Dave could go as far out as he wanted to.
Okay, so I have two more questions.
Yeah.
And simultaneously, I don't know which to ask first, and they might actually be the same question. So we'll see.
What's the last one first, then?
I'll have to think that through. So I'll ask this one. Why did you write a book about Dave Brubeck?
Oh, well, simply because he was the reason I became a musician.
You're a musician?
Yeah, yeah. My father's a painter, and every night when he painted in the family home, he used to listen to Time Out, and from the age of sort of 6 or 7, I used to keep myself awake to hear Blue Rondo a la Turk. And it's just one of those, this was in the northeast of England. There was no kind of cultural link to, America or New York or modern jazz, but this music just, God, it just spoke to me. And it's simply, that was the starting point of my interest in music. And then Dave managed to do the whole thing again. When I was about 14, I came across an album called We're All Together Again for the First Time, which brought Paul Desmond back into the group that Dave formed after the classic group ended, with Jerry Mulligan and a drummer called Alan Dawson. And there's a track on that album called Truth, where Dave, he plays, he just demolishes at the changes and plays all the solo after a kind of introductory bit, which is all kind of in jazz at time. He goes into clusters and sort of slamming at the keyboard, and going into a kind of a sort of gladiatorial duel with the drummer, Alan Dawson. And I'd never heard the piano played like that, and it just completely blew my mind. Mm-hmm. Just the sheer sort of energy and the sound of it. Within a week, I was listening to kind of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Edgar Varese and Cecil Taylor and sort of the sort of outest of outest John Coltrane. Right. So, I mean, sort of twice before I was, sort of at 14, Dave managed to kind of, transform my idea of what music could be. So he was always, the idea of a Brubeck book was always going to happen somehow. And then I got to know him, and the first piece I wrote as a journalist in about 1999 was an interview with Dave. And then this opportunity, I came up in 2003 to write a bigger article and to shadow the quartet. And I spent, I didn't spend, the tour was 10 days. I didn't spend, literally every sort of day with them. But during that 10-day period, I used to meet them, and I'd go on the band, a bus to the gig, and then sort of drive it back. And we did these incredibly long, in-depth interviews. So yeah, it just sort of it was the book I was always going to write, I think.
Okay, and it sounds like the sense I get is that you, and this is a follow-up, not the last question. The sense I get is that in addition to having him as a musical hero, you found a really good guy too, which is one of the reasons I love Louis Armstrong is, he's such a good guy.
I mean, I mean, I was just a fan, simply. I met him for the first time when I was a music student, and I sent him a piece I'd written, and, I was kind of, I wasn't even nobody. I was just a kind of, first year music student, and I sent him this piece because I knew he was playing near my university. And and he'd actually, when I got to the concerts, again, I'll praise you a little bit because it's slightly more complicated than this, but I ended up at backstage afterwards, and he'd actually had the piece, and he'd written some chords down which he liked, and he played them on the piano, and he said, keep in touch. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's really going to happen. He's really going to keep in touch with me. Anyway, the next time I had something ready, I sent it to him, and about a week later, a letter arrived, and that's sort of how we started, corresponding and communicating. And yeah, he just had this, he just sort of draw, well, obviously people were drawn towards him, but he wasn't like sort of Miles or Keith Jarrett or someone who, if you approach them after a gig, they probably, sort of trying to get you arrested or something. Sort of Dave had this way of, sort of embracing people and, sort of recognizing kindred spirits and respecting, people's sort of views on his music.
Beautiful. So I'm going to read something
Yeah,
I'm gonna put you on the spot, I think. I'm gonna read something from your introduction.
I can handle it.
I'm sorry?
I can handle it. Go for it.
You can I'm sure, no, I'm sure you can handle it. Quote, I wanted to shine a light on how Brubeck, thoughtful and sensitive as he was, had been changed as a musician and as a man by the troubled times through which he
Mm.
lived and during which he produced such optimistic, life-enhancing art, close quote.
Mm.
Um, what does that, and obviously we're all living through very difficult times now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not debatable. What do you think Dave Brubeck would say to young musicians today through the kind of the lens of what you wrote here?
That, art is a way of deflecting all the troubles in the world. The idea that jazz is a music, and sort of jazz, well, I mean, not no, he wouldn't have just said jazz. Actually, he would have embraced all music, but sort of jazz in particular, it's all about a communication between sort of different spirits of people, people from different backgrounds. And he was a West Coast a pianist. Eugene Wright was from Chicago. Paul Desmond from San Francisco. He's a drummer, Joe Morello from the East Coast. And over the years, he had sort of his drummer Randy Jones, who took over in I think '79. He was a British, and he had a British bass player at a point. And really, all this music was about a communication between people of different backgrounds, and people actually being sensitive enough to listen to people, and sort of that's occasionally argue out differences, both verbally and in the music. But really, sort of jazz is about listening and respecting each other. And if somebody is a soloing, you sort of help them along. You don't sort of get in their way.
Right.
You don't. So yeah, I think he saw music as a sort of a it was obviously a sort of intellectual and a technical thing, but it definitely for him it had a sort of a humanitarian side, if that's not sort of too sort of a grandiose a word, but he definitely believed in the improvement of society through art. And America, the sort of circles he moved in America in the 1950s. I mean, sort of jazz was on the table, and his producer at George Avakian was also working with John Cage, and sort of people around him were interested in sort of modern literature and abstract painting. And this was a sort of this he didn't exist in a kind of dumb world. It was people who thought, people who thought about art, and people who thought about a society and the connections between them. And he one of the last appearances he made in his life was when he picked up the Kennedy Art Award, from President Obama, and Obama made a fantastic speech and said, and I paraphrase, but he said something like, "To understand America, you have to understand jazz, and to understand jazz, you have to understand Dave Brubeck." And I just to sort of imagine Dave sitting there thinking, "My goodness, this is probably." Sort of Obama had, sort of Obama is this amazing, sort of thinker and an orator, and that somehow just sort of crystallizes everything that Dave stood for. And I can imagine, Dave would have been incredibly moved by that. And yeah, and I mean, it goes without saying, he would have been, I mean, utterly horrified at everything that has happened since Obama left, and the state of America, and the president who seems, hell bent on, sort of stirring up, differences between different parts of America. And it's exactly, it's, I mean, I just can't imagine how absolutely horrified Dave would have been. And actually, Trump, after Dave died, Trump tweeted to say, obviously long before he was a president, this was in 2012, and Trump actually tweeted to say, how much he enjoyed Dave's music. But I don't think it would have been reciprocated, to be honest.
I think that's that Trump tweeted on the death of Dave Brubeck is an interesting. He wouldn't have done that today, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, Trump tweets on everything, you know, so perhaps, you know.
He wouldn't go near jazz. That's not his base.
No, no.
Phil, I'd like to thank you very, very much. These are great
It's a
insights.
pleasure.
It's been an absolute thank you, and it's been an absolute pleasure for me. Again, the book is Dave Brubeck, A Life in Time, and I'll have whatever links you give me in the post for people
Thank you.
to get a hold of that. So thank you very, very much.
It's a
And
pleasure.
look forward to reading the book and speaking to you in the future.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Carl
Thank you.
Wanshank for the Daily Music Break, and keep listening to great music. Thank you. Bye-bye.